Lingo, gold chatter.
Oh, you started up
He
again.
started up again.
I used to come to the early when I see the show, the early one. No,
It's a 6:30 tomorrow.
the Gemara was. None of that was.
Yeah,
I believe by. I believe by the I stayed for March here. When I started up again, switched it up.
If you went to
No, no, no. You can ask.
Thank you.
Didn't happen
Came
in
to
between.
Marsh here.
Pretty much it worked out. Yeah, so. But now you stay for this and you can't stay for the other.
He's a funny guy. This is the better time for you?
Early time is bad. Yeah.
Early was better for you.
You gotta go to work.
So now you want to work later?
Not really. I dived beforehand instead, so. So diving afterwards and diving before.
It works out. So did you get any extra sleep because of this?
No.
No extra sleep, huh?
I'm a brother.
What time did you get up?
I live with my brother-in-law at Charlotte.
So you're ready up since 4 o'clock?
Not today, because today is not the day, but yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, 11 p.m.
I do.
That's like it's
Yeah.
what
No,
Oh, in my house.
2 miles out of town.
Really was.
But you see that one.
And that's
Huge. But I know
is
it's
Which one?
And you have another 2 hours, 3 hours after that. Because you can't even go to bed. If you want to, you have fun.
No, I'm good.
Yeah. I mean, officially, it's helped you sleep.
I think the body can do much more than people think it can.
Yes. That's for sure. Based on the average, what I would do now, I'm basing it on that.
If it was based on an
If
average-
it was based on your potential, I would say, oh my goodness, that's all you're doing. That's all you're doing. That's all
That's what you
you're
should
doing.
be saying. That's correct.
We would also have a problem with educating our kids. We wouldn't feel good. That's all. That's all. You're learning all these 6 hours in this shit. Don't worry. All these 6 hours. 9 hours? What are you talking about? 24 hours. You need 20 minutes sleep. That's all. What do you call REM?
20 minutes, 20 minutes every
What do you call
couple hours.
REM?
Yeah, right.
No, they are. No.
Why you guys get radical?
Radicalized.
Middle of a conversation.
Oh my goodness, it was saying what the potential can be of the human being. If it was put to the
A little bit more upgraded.
right, upgraded mind. This guy's up since 4.
Why don't?
He's learning with his brother-in-law and it's still 4:30 in the morning.
Why don't they?
What do they eat?
We should.
No question about it.
We're lazy.
People do, it's all about decisions, it's all about.
Average person. That's something
You
that
know what
we
it
don't
is.
teach. That our
Not, we don't.
We hear stories, right?
We definitely don't emphasize it, we definitely don't emphasize it. It's hard, but it's more like, yeah.
I was never taught this. I don't know why he did. That was like one of them. Whenever says you do 2 tries to use 1.
Really?
It's beautiful. In the morning,
You know, you can have it as one of the
They were giving you
my
a
folders.
So like, good kid.
That's what they call it, mistakes.
One night you could do more. You could do more.
why is that?
You could do it around the only thing is, it's a hard balance. Because the mentality is that when we push, right, it can become compound. You're not good at it. If you were taught first to read this, how to be mashpia these things in a proper way that they can be macabre, then you're right. Then we should. I think that we just, a lot of us, not putting you, excluding you, is that the reputation of coming down serious, that's very judgmental. I said, no. He says, you'd be satisfied with that? He says, no, we were just telling you that we would be worried if you were satisfied with that. They compensated. So they said, then you don't have anything to worry about. It was like, it's never, but I know you're sick. And there is always a time and everything. There's no offer of life. If you fall in love with your parents, you're still not doing enough. But the Rebbe wants to really get the heart. Every single person come up with his own Chidushim all the time. Books that he published, and every single kid has to. So if you look, in 77 years, the yeshivas publishing every month. Artists of the kids, like Gemara and Chassidus, your own artists. But yeah, you're right.
They are.
Definitely, so you have a
So it's part of my life, I guess.
But it's all about who says it. That's what's where it's coming from. Is it because I want you to be like me, like you give me that, or because I want you to reach my attention? So it's a hard.
FaceTime.
Like think about it. When we ask the kids to do something, same practice. Where's it coming from? We want them to do it because of us. We want to do it because we want them to maximize their ability. So I think that's one of the things in the lesson, because it just comes out very easy. That's why it's also how much it's just distracting. And we're just lazy. No, I'm not putting that aside also.
Hashem put that to us.
Yoshka, what's up?
It's much easier not to.
Yoshka was a
I
good
think
one.
it was quite a hard thing.
You like to fly up.
But you do know that
Must be able to look
the
at
statement
the
goes,
Rebbe
values are
Rabbi James will make sure that he's not on time.
And I think the same thing with the parent of kids. Yoshka was a good choice. Going the extra mile, going out of the comfort zone. They tend to push themselves. My Chinese, you see my Chinese kids, natural culture, they push themselves hard. Russian, they come, third world countries come here because that's the culture. Cultures to push hard and perseverance. I was in Long Island, I was at a public center. And the kids, I want to put a film of one of the kids over there. I remember I was at one of the classmates. Everyone's like, we're like, public school. So the mother was over here, and what he's asking. So the kid, like, all of a sudden, like, dawned upon him, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe I don't, maybe this is not a good thing. So I said, hold on. I said, wait, before you answer that question, ma'am, what's your name? Rachel. I just want to make sure you ask your kid the same question before he wakes up and goes to school. Every day. He's comfortable with getting out of bed to go to school. Is he okay with it? Is he comfortable? Coffee with his dog? It's so comfortable.
You was here? I didn't see him. Okay, yeah. He gave me a lift.
Okay, good.
He has to be here. On the holidays.
You bet. You gotta have that extra push.
Supposed to sleep in today. You're supposed to sleep in today, no? America sleeps in today. Perfect. Grace and thank you, Marsha. It worked out.
Yeah, everything's great.
I'm saying you used it
Yeah,
too?
yeah.
Okay. VIP.
Hope they don't take my car.
No, no. Record, I guess. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Baruchim Aboyim, welcome. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to have you. To one and all, Kulam Ke'echad. So we are up to page Nun. We're going to continue inside. Page Nun, page Nun. Rolling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 lines from the bottom. Line starts Pnimius, Atzmius, Chachmasei Chuli. V'nimtza be'emes. So v'nimtza, the summation of everything that's been discussed till now, is that be'emes, when you look at it from a true and wholesome perspective, when you look at it from a complete perspective, ein ze helem v'hester klal. The concealment that we have been talking about, employed by the teacher, by the mashpia, by the mentor, to influence his student, even though we explained that he has to curtail and restrict and limit and mitigate and compromise and dilute, and all of the good words that represent obstruction and concealment and a blockage, in order to convey the messages, the themes, the truths. If he would give the full depth of any idea, he would confuse the student rather than enlighten the student. He would overwhelm him rather than educate him. He would have him shut down rather than open up. He would drown him rather than lift him up. And he would simply not get through to him rather than have an impact and penetrate. And for this, he must conceal, he must mitigate, he must condense and contract and give only a limited, what he calls here, a ray, like a ray of the sun. There's only a very finite expression of the sun. If the entire sun would enter into any given home or room, or even too close to the planet, we know the results would be not just eating toast for breakfast, but being toast for breakfast, and even more than toast, ayin ve'efes, wouldn't be much, it wouldn't be very edible at that point. So when you have a ray of the sun that allows us to enjoy the heat, to enjoy the light, to enjoy the luminescence, in a way that our kalim, our existences, can absorb it. So the student needs to get a ray. In addition to that, he must often employ the mashal, as we explained, the metaphor, the parable, in which contains the wisdom. And all this is a hester, it's a concealment, because it doesn't give this teacher, the student, full access, and it may completely even cause him to get stuck in the mashal and not come to the nimshal. Nonetheless, we explained this is not a real concealment. Not only for the teacher, Micah Mashmallah, of course for the teacher it's not, because he comes from inside out, as explained. But even for the student, there's no real concealment here. The entire concealment is part of the process of revelation, of giving, of communication. In order to give, you have to block. If not, you won't have a student anymore. In order to bring this truth to a lower place, to a different place, you have to channel it. You have to give it in a way that is communicated in the fashion that can be absorbed and internalized and received by the receptacle without destroying the receptacle, which causes the receptacle simply to disengage in order to protect itself. So what looks like concealment is really, from a deeper perspective, even from the student's perspective, he will realize one day is only the objective of revelation, of gilui, of communication, of the fact that I want to bring this to him. And therefore I have to go through this process of appreciating who he is or who she is, and then channeling the wisdom in a way that a trickle of it can trickle down into his vessel and he can absorb it. Furthermore, it's not just this is better than nothing. Within the brevity and within the concise message, a real teacher contained everything, all the depth. It may take 40 years, but the student has everything, because when he will get what he gets, he will be able to go back and climb back the ladder with this information by dissecting it and reach a space where he and the mashpia ultimately become the same. He can grasp it the way it was in the mind of the teacher before and pre any tzimtzum. It's just his process is a different process. The mashpia comes from inside out, he comes from outside in, what he calls ur yashar versus ur chayzer. So therefore, on any level, there's no real concealment here. Kiyim adirab. If you want to say the truth, it's the exact contrary. Adirab means to the contrary. The entire Hester is really a gilui. It's the way of processing and transporting the the energy, the light, to another domain, to a lower place, from teacher to student, because he wants to share it, not because he wants to hold back. The entire holding back is only the process of revelation. And even the full depth is ultimately being revealed here, even though at this moment it's being concealed, because if it wouldn't be concealed, he would not have Gilu, he would not have any of it. And that's true in any real communication of new ideas, of real depth, that one always has to consider what the other person can hear, not be and hold back accordingly, not because you want to hold back, because you want to give, and you want to give everything. And in order to give everything, you have to make sure that you give it in a way that the person can absorb it, and that's always a process. If it's to be a communication that really builds the person and goes into him, rather than just overwhelms him, and then it's not communication, then it's like the sun burning up the world, the planet, and then you have nothing left. It's not communication, it's not hashpa. This is the chal, this is all a mashal. This is all a mashal about a mashal, right? He's explaining what a mashal is, and he's giving a mashal to explain what a mashal is. So what's the mashal? The mashal is from the mashpia and the makab. But this whole concept is really a mashal. Now you'll ask, why did he have to have this mashal? So now we know why he had to have this mashal. Because without the mashal, it would be extremely difficult to understand the nimshal. Just like planet Earth is a mashal for Malchus, the Atzilus, as explained. And just like Nigla of Torah is a mashal for Nister, as we explained from the Vilna Gaon and from the Shalah and other Svarim, that Nigla is also a mashal for a nimshal. And really the mashal and the nimshal are the same. It's not two separate realities. One is the outer of the inner. One is the manifestation of the inner core in a physical fashion. And essentially, if you think about it, we spoke about this at length. The first Maimah we learned was in Torah Purim. The Maimah Chayev Inish Lepsumah Bepuria Adela Yadav in our Hamala Baruch Mordechai. And there he discusses, the Balatanya says something very heavy. The Gemara says that in Sanhedrin, that the Pasuk says, Ki Dvar Hashem Baza, Hikaris Tikaris. Somebody disgraced the word of God, he'll be cut off. So the Gemara says it's talking about somebody called Mishayach Elasik B'Torah, Ve'ena Yosik, Allah Darsh Razal, Ki Dvar Hashem Baza, Hikaris Tikaris. Somebody who has the ability to learn Torah and he doesn't learn, on him the Pasuk says, as Gemara in Sanhedrin, I think Tzaddik Tes, that he disgraced the word of God and the soul gets cut off. So Baal Tanya asks a very interesting question. There's no limit to this. You have a Jew, you remember, you have a Jew, he's a businessman. The Gemara in Sanhedrin and Hilchos Talmud Torah, you have shiurim, how much a person has to learn. Right? The Gemara says there's a person who's yotzeh. Everyone has to learn something. Mitzvahs Talmud Torah is on every Jew, every day. But how much? So the Gemara says, is a person is yotzeh perik echad shachris or perik echad arvis? He said Kriya Shema in the morning. He said Parsha Shema in the evening, in the afternoon, in the evening. Arvis was yotzeh Talmud Torah. Then there's the person on whom it says v'hagisa boy yoyim v'layla. And it really depends on your mind, on your capacity, on your circumstances. Today they would say on your ADD level, on your ADHD level, on your PDD level. Of course, what you're involved in, what your parnasa is. Person has a responsibility, of course, to support their family, to support themselves, support their wife, support their children. A person has to know what their capacity is. And it's a very relative issue. And it's a very personal issue, where you are in life, what you're capable of, how you use your time, and so on and so forth. So he says, how can it be that something, for one person, you're saying he's Yotzeh Perek Echad Shachar Perek Echad Arvis. The other person, he learned hours and hours and hours, yeah? And then there was a moment he wasn't Isaac and Torah, he chorus to chorus. I understand you say Chametz on Pesach is chorus, dam, eating dam is chorus, Chilul Shabbos is chorus, Achilas Yom Kippur is chorus, B'mezid, etc. But here, it's a very relative issue. The Baal Tanya says, which is also a paradigm shift in how you understand chorus. And the main point he makes there, I'm not going to go into the whole arichas there, it's also probably on the site of that Maimon Chayavinish in Torah Purim. But I'm sure it's there, if anybody wants to make chazara, but it's very consistent with all the discussions here, because the point, a lot of this is meyusad on that, is on that Maimon. Certain points about the Moshel and the Nimshel. And that is that the Neshama in Gan Eden experiences a certain light. That light, the neshama has to be able to be capable of experiencing. Okay? The divine providence that leads a person to his or her parnasa, and therefore gives them a certain amount of time and energy to be able to learn Torah, it's not a random thing. It has to do with this type of soul. As he puts it, this type of soul, in order to be able to reach its place, it has to go through the moshel in order to get to the nimshel. Because the Torah in Gan Eden is the same Torah that we learn here. Just one is in the world of Gashmi, one is in the world of Ruchni. One is the moshel, one is the nimshel, which in Torah it's not two separate things. In anything it's not two separate things. It's really the same. So he said if this Jew had that hour and he didn't learn that Torah, right? He chorus to chorus, his soul is getting cut off from a certain energy, from a certain place that it belongs in, because it simply didn't have the marshal to be able to get to the nimshal.
So it's not onish? It's not the harkaris tikaris milashon onish?
Right. Like every einish, it's a concept of a consequence. There's the certain light that this neshama needs, and it doesn't have access to, because it didn't go through the marshal down here to be able to get to that nimshal. And this is a very relative issue. So that's where the Gemara says, Kol Mishayis B'Torah V'Einei. So this is true about everything in the world, as we said, everything in Torah. That's what the Shalah says about Dover Gadol and Dover Katan, etc., as discussed in previous show. Now we come back to the Nimsh. It says, Hadugma Mikol Zayuvan Lamaila B'Inyan Shem Havaya V'Elikim. All of this is an example, a dugma, a marshal, to understand Shem Havaya and Elikim. Shem Elikim Ubchinas Midas HaTzimtzum V'Hester. The name Elikim represents the attribute of Tzimtzum and Hester. Tzimtzum means restriction. Hester means concealment. The function of Shem Elikim is to restrict and eclipse the energy, so to speak, from Shem Havaya, the name Yudkei Vavkei, for one purpose. There should be able to be the emergence. Hisavos means emergence, existence, from the word Hoiva, right? Yehava, Hisavos, to be. Hoya, Hoiva, Yia, isness, is Hoya, the existence. We're able to be the emergence of the world, the isness, is-ness, the isness of the worlds. I know, I made up a word, yeah. Sheyuchalias Hisavos Olam, as Webster Kenished, So Shem Elikim is the Midas HaTzimtzum in order to allow for his Havas Olamus. That's what we said earlier in the Maimer. We spoke about Oiris and Kalim, Havaya, Elikim. Elikim is Helam, Havaya is Gil. The Hinen is Boyalel, as we explained earlier, the Shem Havaya Makar Hagilu. The name Havaya represents, when we say Yud Kei Vav Kei, what does it represent? Represents the source of revelation, meaning, Vahainu, Gilui Oir B'Bchinas Bli Gvul. A revelation of divine energy that is infinite, like its source. The ha'or davug b'mayir v'hu me'ein ha'mayir. The definition of or, when we use in the language of Chassidus or Kabbalah the word or, it's a metaphor. Why do we use the word light? Because light has the properties that are very appropriate metaphor to understand a little bit the nature of the divine energy that emanates. The definition of or is it's davug b'mayir. It's always connected to the source. You can't close the window shade and ask, where did the light disappear? Where did the light disappear? When I give you information, when an artist paints a painting, even if the artist is gone, the painting remains. When light is communicated from the source, if the light is separated from the luminary, from the source, there's no light anymore. The Oir is always Davak b'Mayir. That's number one. Number two, it's Me'ein ha'Mayir. And the two are dependent on each other. It tells you about the Mayir. It reflects the source. The light of the sun is such a type of light that when you analyze it, it's reflective of its source, of the properties of its source. The light of the moon is the light of a moon. The light of a flashlight, the light of a light bulb is its own unique light. And then there's LED, has its own unique light. Every Oir reflects, Me'ein means it reflects the Mayir. That's why we use the word Oir, because the name Oir, which is light, is a metaphor. And the metaphor of light is, one of its metaphors is, that it reflects its source, and it's connected to its source. In this case, the luminary is not the sun, it's infinite. So the Oir is also infinite. The Oir is also infinite. And by the way, I'm not going to get into this at the moment, because this is not a Maimer so much focused on Oir, even though somewhat focused on Oir is. The fact is that some of the greatest paradoxes in physics today we observe in light, to the point that the nature of light staggers the imagination of scientists and physicists. For example, there's always the paradox, is light a particle or is light a wave? We have in the world, we have what we call particles and waves. Particle would mean if I'm throwing marbles, right? Or cherries, each one is a particle. A wave is a wave of water, for example, right? Which travels as a cohesive, integrated group. It's one larger entity. As a mikveh, or you see it in a beach, it's a wave, versus particles which are individualized. So they studied light, and it acted like a particle, which has its own way of behavior. The problem is it also acted as a wave, which has a paradoxical type of behavior. And somehow, it has a dual identity. The problem is it's a duality that's paradoxical. There's many elements in the properties of light that represent the fact that there's something very mysterious here, very paradoxical. And the reason is because Oir is a mashal for Oir Ein Sof. And we explained that the mashal reflects the nimshal. So everything about the physical properties of light will be such that reflect the nimshal. The difference, of course, is because it assumes ultimately a physical incarnation, even though light is not as physical as other things. It's very, very nebulous. But Sof Kol Sof, it's physical. So you're not going to have the nimshal in its full infinity. That's what the mashal is. The mashal brings it down. But in light, you could see complete paradoxical features that do not make sense rationally. And Ad Hayom Hazeh, the studies of light, as they continue, literally stagger the imagination, including the fact that once we observe it, it collapses into one identity, and it doesn't retain its paradoxes anymore, because we can't absorb that with our eyes. So when we observe it, it's either this or that, but really we prove that it's really both. Two paradoxes in the same entity. This is all about Oir. Oir is a mashal for the Oir that we're talking about, which is the Oir which is Ein Sof. If so, all oir is not commensurate with the universe, as any universe. Why? The definition of a world, even the highest spiritual world, is two things: yesh and gvul. Yesh means it has identity, and gvul means it has finiteness, it has parameters. Infinity and finiteness are not a match for each other. That itself, one has to be able to absorb. Oir Ein Sof is bli gvul. All oilamus, every universe is based on identity, which is yesh. Yesh means there's something that has an identity. And gvul, and the two are mismatched. Omnam, ef shali is havas oilamus, ki mehagilu Oir Ein Sof. But now we have the opposite issue. You can't bring in the world without revelation of Ein Sof. Every pu'ula, every activity, can only happen if the activating power emerges. So we have here a problem. The revelation of Oir Ein Sof obliterates the possibility for a world. But the concealment of Oir Ein Sof also obliterates the possibility for a world. There's no way a person, let's take in a person, can activate anything, can do any activity without some manifestation of your koyach. You want to throw a football, right? The koyach has to leave your hand and enter into the football and express itself through that football. And depends on how strong and how intense that power is, that's how high and that's how long and that's how skilled the throw will be, and hopefully the catch will be. But every pu'ula comes through a hisgalus of koyach hapoel. If you hold back, you can't act. Activity, any type of action of any sort, is from your koyach coming out. You have to go out, not in. Retreating is basically when you want to go to sleep, you want to rest, you retreat. But when you act, the koyach has to come out. So to create a world, the Ein Sof has to come out, not stay in. You have to create a world. Where's the world coming from? But if it comes out, there can't be a world. And this is why there's something called the name Elokim. What does the name Elokim represent? It conceals, it restricts, and conceals and eclipses the Oir. V'hu, what do we mean? V'hu, the Oilabis are created from Shem Havaya. But it's always through the channel of Elokim. Just like we spoke in the mashal of the teacher and the student. If he communicates his full brilliance and genius and depth in anything he's discussing, you have no student. You have a confused person. Here it's not only you have a confused world, you got no world, because you have no gvul. So therefore, what's Shem Elokim? It allows Shem Havaya to be channeled in a way that the pnimius of Oir, the core of the Oir, the infinity, is concealed, and what's channeled, what comes out, is an external ray of it. This is the entire concept that is a frequent theme in the entire Teres HaNister, and it's explained in Chassidus Chabad at length. The concept of Kalim of Esses Spheres Atzilus. Atzilus is considered the highest world. Kalim means containers. The Oir of Ein Sof must go into the containers which give it identity. Suddenly you have a quality of Hashem called Chachma, a quality called Chesed. That's identity and it's finite. The fact that you can identify Hashem by characteristics, Rachum, Chanun, Rav Chesed, Emes, Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Hakeil, Hagadol, Hagibur, V'Hanoira, all of these qualities and characteristics is the way the indivisible and infinite and undefined Oir assumes some type of identity, which is called a Keli. What's a Keli? A Keli is a container. The container contains the Oir and molds it according to its identity. And that's why he says there's a division. There's something called Chachma. There's something called Chesed. Without the Kalim, what would be? The Oir would be Ein Sof and Bli Gvul. The recipient can only be something that's part of Ein Sof, not something that has a distinct identity and a distinct reality, even the most spiritual identity, which has its parameters. This is I. A world means there's something that exists outside, at least in its own perception, outside of the Ein Sof. V'yesh l'bchinas erech v'shaychus la'olamus. That's the key. The keli has an erech, it has a shaychus, it has a relationship with the world. Just like the teacher, who by taking his wisdom and containing it and channeling it in a limited fashion, it's now relatable to the mind and the heart of the student. If not, there's no training somebody else. There's no bringing the light to a lower place. You could sit in your own cocoon and do your own learning, but you can't communicate. You're not a mashpia. You're not a giver.
But doesn't that make it finite? Because the olamos, by definition, the kalim of the olamos are finite. So
Yeah.
doesn't that make the art finite?
Yeah.
So it's finite within the
It's
finite within the keli. It's infinite.
the oid on its own is Ein Sof. The ability of the keli is what allows it to be channeled, that the recipient should be able to receive it. So you want to know if the physical world is Ein Sof or not Ein Sof? Well, that's the whole mashal here. Is the teacher giving the student the full thing, or is he not giving him the full thing? On one hand, it would seem he's not. We'll soon see, however, that that's only a superficial perspective. He really is. That's the entire discussion here. This very question that you're asking. Yeah.
The teacher and the student are both creating kalim? The teacher creates kalim?
The student, of course, has to have the keli. If the student doesn't put in the effort, he's not going to get anything, of course. He has to show up, too. It works both ways. The teacher got to show up in his way, and the student got to show up in their way, and then they could meet. They have to give it all they got. He opens up his kalim, and then the teacher can fill it. But the teacher has to fill his keli. And if he doesn't fill his keli, right? If he doesn't fill his keli, then it's not going to work. He has to fill his canteen. And that's why all types of teaching, anyone here who's taught or mentoring on any level, is an excruciatingly challenging task. Because it's not just you have patience and you're a nice guy and you know the material. That's all important. But the key of being able to identifying the world of the student. Identifying it. Number one. Number two, having the desire to be able to go into that world. And number three, having the skill to be able to compress your knowledge in a way that can be channeled through those kalim. That's all a big avoid. It's not simple. And what you don't say, as I said, is equally important to what you do say. Huh? Somebody after the shiur came over to me and said, "So what don't you say during the shiur?"
You don't say it.
He said, "I want to know what you don't say. What you don't say."
You couldn't handle the conversation.
No, he just wanted to understand. He said, "What don't you say?"
But if you understood, you wouldn't ask.
I appreciated the question.
Rabbi, isn't it that even what you do say, everybody hears it differently anyway?
That's also true. That's true too. Yeah.
Isn't that the paradox with teaching?
Yeah. We'll see. Yeah.
How does the Kalim have the ability to restrict the art, which you can't, if the art is coming the way it is?
That's a good question. How can the Keli restrict Ur, which is Ein Sof? How do you restrict infinity? That's a good question. Like, what's this magic trick of the Kalim to be able to... It's a very good question. We'll see. It's a good question. That's what he explained before, that the Koyach HaGbola comes also from the teacher himself. Atazoi. Koyach HaGvul is part of Koyach. The Avodas HaKodesh says that Koyach HaGvul is really a chelik of Koyach HaBli Gvul.
What does that mean? I've understood this. It's like something I never grasped. Heard it
Okay.
Work on those.
Okay, yeah.
Why do we introduce?
It's a good to Shaila, yeah.
We introduced Hester in addition to Tzimtzum. Are we defining a difference?
Yeah, Tzimtzum and Hester. What's the difference of Tzimtzum and Hester? Tzimtzum means restriction, like litzamtzem, to be mitzamtzem, right? The Gemara has an expression a lot of times. Ene yachal litzamtzem esatzmai. Litzamtzem means to be mitzamtzem, to restrict, to limit. The Medrash has an expression. Tzimtzem shchinasoi ben shnei badei ha'aron. God compressed His divine presence between the two poles of the aron. Tzimtzem shchinasoi ben shnei badei ha'aron. So tzimtzum is like channeling something, like through a canal. You know, you have a large source of water, a large pool of water, and then you channel it through a canal, the way they irrigate some of the fields, right? You channel it through a very narrow canal, and if you expand it, you're going to flood the field. You need a trickle of water. Helam and Hester are already much more dramatic. Those are concealments. To give an example, you can have a little hole in a wall, in a prison wall, and the light of the sun comes through that hole. That light is mitzumtzum, but it's not muster. It's mitzumtzum. You're not getting the full intensity. It's being restricted. But what you're getting is pure. Right? Helam and Hester means already it goes through transformations where the actual light is concealed. You may not even know it's that light. So it's different processes. Like we spoke before, there's the teacher giving a trickle of information, and then there's the teacher dressing it up in a mushal. That's already concept of Helam or Hester.
She was going through Hester Panim, would love to have Tzimtzum instead of Hester Panim.
Right. Tzimtzum is a whole different experience than Hester.
Ultimately, it's for the same end purpose.
Yes, the same end purpose. It's just different processes in the communication.
Is it a keli or it's a filter? Keli seems more something to contain it. What we're saying is that it's being filtered so that we can.
When you say keli here, we mean also a filter. Also a filter, because when we use the word keli, it means it's finite. It contains it. It gives it structure. It gives it parameters. And when you're dealing with infinity, you're going to have a filter for that. You have to filter out the revelation of infinity. That's what every keli does. The function of a keli is to contain, but also to give size, shape. Like when we use molds, right? You do a mold, you're giving it definition, and that's how it's going to be accessed. When you build anything, you shape a brick, or anything you shape, and you use a mold for it. What does that mold do? It doesn't change the material, but it shapes the material. It shapes the material. And the product is going to be affected by that shape. In other words, the product that comes from the oil after the keli is going to be affected by the shape of the keli, so to speak. The size, the shape, the color, the dimensions, the quality, the texture. Because that's the access. I can't get back to the material the way it was pre the mold. I now have it through the mold, and that's what I wanted. I wanted it in this shape. So the keli also creates the mold. It creates all of these dimensions that give it parameters and identity and restrictions and so forth. And in everything in life, as we spoke many times, is Iris and Kalim. There's nothing in life that exists as an Ur without a keli and it's going to last. It's not going to. Everything has to take on a shape. We have dreams, and as long as the dreams are in our mind, they are very big and expansive and heavenly and universal. And in your dream, you know, you can affect the world, and tomorrow you'll come out with $9 billion already by New Year's. You know, but there's only one problem. It's a dream. It's a dream, and it's a dream in your head. The keli is where dreams have to take on shape. Keli is when you come home and you share it with your wife, and she nods. She's like, "Okay, you're on one of those trips again, right?" Because generally, feminine energy has to do with kalim a lot. Kalim is the womb. You can give birth to children, but you have to have a womb. It's called a rechem. A rechem is the womb that carries it, and that's very critical, because when there's no rechem, there's no birth. That's called it's the ability to be able to carry the oil, and that's true in every project and experience in life. Kalim is giving it shape, and it's not fun, because whenever you have to give something shape, you also have to figure out what doesn't belong in the shape. Kalim are always about rejection. This doesn't fit. This doesn't fit. This in the oil, it's all encompassing. Just like in the source, it's Ein Sof. I'm just giving a mashal again. I'm not talking about the nimshal. Again, we're talking about the mashal. But as always, the mashal reflects the nimshal. And kalim give it shape. They give it a mold. And they're brutal. They're not fun. No kalim are fun. It's the difference between the artist and the businessman. It's the difference between the dream and implementation of the dream. It's the difference between the concept and the facilitating of the concept. Actualizing, yeah. You know, you have a book in your mind. You want to write a book. Write it. It's not going to be easy. Any person here has ideas. A lot of people have ideas. Sit down by a computer and write it out, and you'll see. It's not going to be easy. It was so clear in your mind. Suddenly there's a blockage. Why? Because writing is always about hislapshus oiris bekalim. When you have to write something, those of you who write know what I'm talking about. The idea in your mind has a freedom to just float expansively and uninhibitedly. How are you going to put this into a paragraph? Could you put this in? You have 1,000 words, put it in. Now you have to think about it in a completely new way. Now you have to cut more than you express. Now you have to hold back. The challenge of writing is not what you're going to write, it's what you're not going to write. And what's editing? Editing is even more. This is redundant, this goes out, this doesn't belong here. Speaking, for example, doesn't require the same amount of kalim as writing. It also requires kalim. It's not like thinking. Kalim and oiris, by the way, are always relative. For example, machshava relative to dibur is what? Oiris relative to kalim, right? You know when you're daydreaming? I don't mean to wake anybody up from a daydream, but I'm sure there's 2 or 3 people who have been daydreaming the last 4 minutes. And over the last 4 minutes, you probably covered 20,000 topics. If I would ask you to say what you daydreamed during the last 2 or 3 minutes, anybody wants to volunteer? It's going to take you more than 2 hours. Why? Because in Oir, you could fly around the universe. When you have to speak about it, it's much more concrete. There's kalim. That's why people say, I have a great idea, say it. They can't say it. Because saying it requires surgery. It's surgery. It's surgery of the idea to get it into vessels, which are words. That's speaking. Writing is even greater kalim. Even more. It's more brutal. Because in speaking, you could be redundant. You can employ many adjectives, and people won't think you're crazy. And et cetera, et cetera. With speaking, you get away with a lot that you can't get away with writing. Writing is much more succinct. Scrutinized, yeah. Right, compact. If not, it's not good writing. It's just sloppy. It's not acceptable. It's not going to affect what you want to affect through writing. That's how it is. So these are all mashalim. Kalim and oiris are always relative, yeah? Sure.
We don't understand it. So the Kalim and Oiris was stuck in my mind about forms and content, because that's what philosophers debate. Is it form that invites the content, or content shapes the form?
Excellent. Form and content, very good. Does the content shape the form, or does the form shape the content? Right? Yeah.
So now we have these few letters Elohim, and that.
Yeah, well, like when we say Shem Elokim, again, it's a mashal. When we say Elokim, well, we're not accessing it when we say Elokim, but it's a mashal that the name Elokim carries that energy that is the Koyach HaGvul that channels the Ein Sof into Kalim.
So basically, in Hasidus is Hasidic garments will invite the Hasidic content, or the Hasidic content will shape us into wearing black clothes.
Okay. Yeah. Do leaders shape their communities, or do communities shape their leaders? Dor lefi haparnas, or parnas lefi hador? Do the Rebbes look like the Hasidim, or the Hasidim look like the Rebbes? Which one comes first? Huh? Okay. It's a grace of art. Yeah. Tsur Yilad Chateshi. Tsur Yilad Chateshi, yeah. Okay.
On this R, articles, R, ways. Do we want something in a rugged shop or somewhere? Oh boy, what is that? I have no clue where. Something with a rugged shop on that.
Yeah, Parshas Bahar. We spoke about the Haftarah of Bahar with Yirmiyah, Sefer Hamakna. Hashem told him to purchase. That's what you mean? During the 3 weeks we did it. What? You mean goal as the end of it all?
The goal of life,
The Gemara says, Talmidei Chachamim ein lahem menucha, loy ba'olam hazeh v'loy ba'olam haba. So the Gemara at the end of Brachas.
That's the reason it's shot?
That's Shenema Yelchu Mechayil El Chayir El Elikim B'Tzion. In other words,
Always striving.
in infinity, there's never. This is it. But when is there? When is there? I mean, even in the physical world, the Medrash says, "Misheyesh le'mana writes a Messiah, Misheyesh le'Masayim writes arba meis."
So this is why he was working so hard with the whole thing with the yarmulke and everything to make sure that we should understand that it's not that it's the same because he wants to make it all simultaneous.
Yes. Ultimately, we wanted to create, show the seamless oneness of it all. The seamless oneness.